chair this evening's discussion on the Japanese economy and how women can change it. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Linda Yu on my far right. I'm sure she'll be familiar to many of you from her previous role as the chief business correspondent of the BBC. And I think she still appears on the BBC, certainly from time to time. But she is now back in academia, so she's a fellow in economics at St Edmund Hall, Oxford University, and she's also adjunct professor of economics at London Business School, just round the corner from here. And she is also the editor of the Routledge Economic Growth and Development series. So I think I'll hand over to you on that, Linda.
Thank you very much, Jason. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Great. If you can't hear at some point, just wave your arms, and we'll all try and speak up. And just to say how delighted I am, thank you very much to Jason, to Nana-san, for inviting me to chair this event this evening. I think it's a highly topical subject, and we have a fantastic panel with which to discuss it. I have been quite interested in Japan's economy for some time, and it's partly covered in a book I've just finished called The Great Economists, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today, and it'll be published in Japanese by Yuko Kawa next year, so I was really pleased that someone in Japan was interested in it. So it's really a pleasure to be here to chair this panel. Let me introduce this terrific panel and then give you a little bit of a running order as to how we're going to structure this evening. So to my far left is Yuko Kawa. She joined the Bank of Japan in 2003, where she's had numerous roles, including as the head of the FX division, chief representative in Hong Kong, and head of the FinTech Center. She's currently the general manager for Europe and the bank's chief representative in London. She's also had a career in the private sector, and as well as an independent think tank as a research director. To her right is Bill Emmett. Bill will be familiar to many of you. He was the editor-in-chief of The Economist from 1993 to 2006. He's written a number of very excellent books on Japan. His latest one that he said he's just finished the first draft of this morning is going to be on the future role of women in Japan's economy, politics, and society, published in Japanese by Nikkei Press at the end of this year. And Bill's just finished being a visiting fellow at All Souls College and Oxford University. And then finally, to my left, Dr. Yumiko Oda, fresh off a flight from Japan. So we're really honored she's here. She's an assistant professor at Hitotsubashi University and the CEO at Mind Mining Inc. A lot of her work focuses on marketing research and her own management consulting company in Tokyo. She previously worked also for a number of private sector firms, and she's helped a number of female leaders of various Japanese multinational companies to develop their leadership skills. So I think you'll agree it's a fantastic panel to do this, to cover this topic, and this is how we're planning to do it. So obviously, I think all of you here will be aware Japan is facing, has had a period of slow growth, and it's facing a number of economic challenges. What we're going to try and focus on is how women can play a role in changing the growth trajectory of Japan, because obviously the demographics is one of the pressures that Japan faces. So in the seminar, we're first going to hear from Yuko Kawa of the Bank of Japan. She'll describe the current state of the Japanese economy and explain the government's approach to addressing the challenges it faces. Bill Emmett will then will get up to the lectern and analyze how Japan's economy may benefit from an increase in female labor force participation, not just the quantity, but the quality. And then Dr. Yumiko Oda will finish us off with a discussion around the limitations to the government's intentions of encouraging a more active role for women in the economy. They'll all speak for 20 minutes each. There'll be a chance for a bit of a discussion around the table, and then importantly, we will open it up to the audience. Now, as many of you who go to Japan or know how the Japanese are, one of the things I most admire about them, and I admire a lot of things about them, is that they're always punctual. So I don't think my job is going to be difficult at all this evening. I'm just going to, they will self-police themselves. They will just sit down after 20 minutes. So,
Me too.
Bill, I've made you an honorary Japanese.
Very good. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for being here. And I, of course, am not only the only non-Japanese speaker, I'm also the only speaker with a beard. So we have to acknowledge my deficiencies in that. What I'm going to do is really three things. The first, an overall message that I will give to you, or approach I will should say, is that in looking at this issue of female empowerment in Japan, the female role in Japanese economy, I have to suspend what has been my normal methodology in looking at Japan, which is to put to one side international comparisons. And the reason for that is because on every international comparison, Japan looks terrible. Japan is behind on everything, as Kawai-san's charts showed. The only comfort is that South Korea is worse on many. But I think that by behind on international comparisons, I mean on leadership roles, on percentage of women in politics, and in the Diet, in governors and mayors, in university, faculty, senior positions, and so on and so forth. Almost every measure you take, Japan is behind. But I think by focusing on that and by treating the glass as permanently more than half empty, we miss the direction of change. And so my argument will be that the direction of change is what we should be focusing on, and that actually is going to be quite substantial over the next 10 or 12 years. So the second thing I'm going to do is to argue why I think there's going to be a substantial change and there's a strong momentum for change. And thirdly, which is really where I'll begin, I want to root that argument in the broad economic state of Japan, building on Kawai-san's excellent lecture and charts, but also why the interests of women are the same as the interests of men today in Japan, in the sense of the economic imperative that is there to determine how prosperous and how well Japan does. Do I just hit that? Yes. So, just two charts to show the long-term reality, of, as it were, of Japan and its performance. As we all know, Japan, along with my other addiction, Italy, are the top. Were at the top in the 1960 to 89. The next quarter century switched to the bottom of basically the G7, along with Italy. Britain, of course, shackled by membership of the EU, was top of the list. That difficulty does conceal, over the long period, though, a recent improvement in Japan's per capita output growth, as Kawai-san said. These are OECD figures. You've got the 15 years to 2012, well behind, but then the last 4 years much more in line with OECD performance. Productivity is the worldwide problem. The worldwide issue, the worldwide paradox, really, of our time is, alongside technological progress, the slow growth in productivity. Japan has suffered from a big slowdown in productivity growth. It's not alone. Everyone has done that. As you can see from this OECD one, the red is Japan in the center. Japan has had a dramatic loss of productivity growth, but is nevertheless better than quite a lot of countries, including Britain and woeful Italy on the far left, but worse than the United States and worse indeed than Korea on that. That slowdown in productivity growth reflects, I'm sure, many worldwide phenomena. It reflects also the long period of adjustment to the stress of the bursting of the bubble over the last 25 years. It also, though, I think, reflects the fundamental change in the labor market in Japan. In 1990, regular workers were 80% of the labor force, and non-regular, short-term contract and part-time workers were only 20%. As we can see, non-regular part-time workers are now up to nearly 40% of the workforce, male and female. More than half of female workers are in the non-regular category, but there are a lot of men as well. And the reason this is, I think, of fundamental importance is that non-regular workers essentially get no training, or very little training. Corporate investment in human capital development, education, training, and skill acquisition was the celebrated strength of corporations, big, small, and medium, in Japan in the 1970s and 1980s, with a long period of loyalty of regular employees. Once you get down to a 60-40 split, that has deteriorated substantially, and a large part of the workforce is emerging highly educated from university, in many cases, but then essentially receiving no further development, or very little further development by employers. So I think that deterioration in the quality of human capital and the use of human capital is a fundamental issue for a country, especially one that has a demographic challenge. It is reflected, I think, and I know Professor Oda will speak much more eloquently about this than I do, it's reflected in a social phenomenon, which is a decline of the marriage rate. This is a chart from The Economist. Percent of 50-year-olds who have never been married. In 2010, more than 10% of 50-year-old women have never been married, or about 20% of men. Why is this? Well, we can come up with all sorts of psychological explanations, but I would say the main one is the previous chart, the growth of non-regular employment. Essentially, marriage is a financial commitment, and a commitment on the male side, especially, of taking financial responsibility traditionally. If you can't get a secure job and you are in a precarious part of the workforce, then you're much less likely to be able to make the move to get married, and indeed brides are very unlikely to consider you worthwhile to marry. So I think that the social issue of decline of marriage, which is often about delaying the age of marriage, but also, as this shows, an increasing proportion of people never being married, is then linked to the fertility rate, which lies behind some of the demographic issues, with Japan having fallen by 2005 to a very low birth rate for adult woman of just 1.25, just below 1.3. Given that so few children are born out of wedlock in Japan, if you've got a declining marriage rate, you're going to have problems with your fertility rate as well. And I think that too has to be linked quite strongly to the duality of the labour market and the rise of precarious work, both for men and women. Of course, going back to that previous chart about regular and non-regular, it's not all bad that you've had an increase in part-time and non-regular. Many people wish to have part-time work by very free choice, and a big rise in the number of part-time and non-regular workers has been the elderly, or the over 65 population. Japan is very high by international standards in the share of over 65s who are in the workforce, around 20%, whereas in Italy the figure is 5%. So this reflects not all bad things, but I think it has some important social consequences. The fertility rate has begun to rise, as that shows. Kawai-san's presentation showed the government target of a 1.8 fertility rate, and that at 1.45 shows there's a way to go. But I think that we should reflect upon the fact that in the United States, France and Sweden, the figure is up above 1.8, and in Britain it's also above 1.8. Is there a reason why it couldn't rise again? Some would say that high immigrant populations facilitate a high level of the fertility rate, but that is unlikely to be actually a large impact in those numbers. I think culture and finances, and that's my argument, are much more important. Oh, wrong way. Now, as was also shown, the remarkable thing of the Japanese labour market has been the rise in the size of the employed population, even as the population overall has been shrinking year by year. And keep pressing the wrong button. And here, as Kawai-san said, what the Italians would call il sorpasso, Japan overtaking the United States in terms of labour force participation. As Kawai-san said, even though Japan is now ahead of the United States, that reflects also the strange decline in male and female participation in the United States. But also, if we had European figures above that, they would be 10 percentage points higher on average. So Japan's female participation is still nevertheless well below most Western European countries. Now, if we look, though, at women and at the movement of women through the workforce, and particularly the questions that we were raising about leadership roles, about how Japan performs so poorly on international comparisons, it seems to me that the very vital place to look is about the social and political choice of going to 4-year university courses. Until the mid-1990s, most Japanese girls went to 2-year junior colleges, even as the male 4-year university entrance rate was up between 30 and 40% of the relevant 18-year-old cohort. The female rate was between 10 and 15%. Other girls in those years were going to 2-year junior colleges. What we see here is a quite dramatic, I would say, change in social and cultural attitudes, as well as some policy influence on that. That has led to a dramatic increase in the share of 18-year-old high school graduates, female high school graduates going to university. Still a gap with the boys, still different from an American or Western European figure, in which the figures would be more or less identical, possibly with women slightly higher than men, but nevertheless a dramatic increase. The 1983 number there, which I look at mainly because that is the year when I first moved to Japan, of course the percentage that were going to 4-year university courses were a percentage of a larger population of 18-year-old girls than there are today. That the number who went into university courses, 4-year university courses, was 110,000. 2017 figures, the number of 18-year-old girls who were going into 4-year university courses was 280,000. So a smaller population, but actually a substantial number coming through. If you look at the 1995 number, just to get the sort of ease, when there was just coming up to passing 20%, that cohort of graduates are now essentially in their early 40s. So that cohort of graduates is the supply of females who have the potential to be moving into some of the higher leadership roles of, from Kawai-san's chart. Only the survivors can be going into those leadership roles, only those who stayed in their companies. But the point is that, as we're in the 40s, the supply of potential female occupants of those roles really is quite small, particularly compared with a very, very large, much larger supply of boys. If we think about the 2000s, what unfortunately we've come to call millennials, there's going to be a dramatic increase in the supply of such four-year educated women who will be working their way through with seniority and age-based structures over the next 30 years. So my strong belief and strong sense is that simply from a supply side dynamic reflecting the changing social and cultural attitudes that have led to that increase in supply is going to produce a big cultural change. The questions that we have to ask is how big the dropout rates will be, what will happen to like the decomposition of those people's employment as they move through the age groups and the seniority structures of organizations. This is happening at a time of labor shortage, and therefore necessity is forcing, I would believe, companies and ministries and other organizations to have to try to change their human resources policies. There's an important caveat to this optimistic upward surge here, however, which is a caveat for the top leadership roles in Japan, which is if we look at the share of students at the top 10 national universities in Japan, the universities like Todai and Kyodai and Doshisha that supply really the top leadership positions in Japanese organizations, the share of female students is on average 28%. So in the top national universities, only on average 28% of the students, undergraduate students, are female. At Harvard, it's 48%. At Oxford last year, it was just slightly more undergraduate freshers were female than male. So there's a big gap in the top national universities. The top private universities, the share of women students is 45%. There's a difference in practice at Keio and Waseda and the other private universities from the top national universities. What is the difference? The difference is in the nature of the entrance exam, point one. Point two, it's in the emphasis of the courses, with more humanities and social sciences in some of the private universities relative to medicine and engineering. But crucially, I'd say it's in the entrance exams, where in the entrance exam for Tokyo University and for the National Center Test, every applicant has to do a maths and a science exam, rather than choosing their exams according to the course they're trying to study. And that produces something of a gender bias because of the relatively low level of study in high schools by females of STEM subjects. So there's an important caveat in the top leadership positions, which are, of course, supplied especially by the Kyodai and Todai and so forth. Corporate change is important. How much is it happening? Well, the crucial things to happen are, first of all, an abolition of the distinction between administrative track recruits and general managerial, Ippan Shoku and Sogo Shoku. Companies are beginning to do that, but not enough. That really needs to be abolished. Secondly, it's clear that a lot of female graduates, surveys of graduates going through those companies do think that they were going to have children. They do think they're going to leave at some point. That is making it more important to have early leadership opportunities opportunities for those women, to give them the confidence and the motivation to return to their jobs. There's a very high quitting rate, not from the workforce, but from the original employer, and that needs to change. And thirdly, companies need increasingly to invest in daycare centers. The Poppins babysitting business in Tokyo has had a surge in corporate contracts and in institutional contracts for its call babysitting services. Daycares and nurseries are a part of a growing business, and the female mayor of Yokohama and the female governor of Tokyo are both building and pushing a big expansion in daycare services. There's still a big gap, as Kawai-san said, but nevertheless they're there. So what finally do I expect to happen? I think that based on the surge of numbers, the cohort effect that's coming through, we could expect a doubling of the scores in leadership roles over the next 10 to 12 years, i.e. by 2030. That will still be quite a low level by international standards, but I think it's going to come. Secondly, if the labour law could be reformed to reduce the difference between regular and non-regular, and if daycare centres are really invested in by companies and HR practices change, I will predict a rise in the birth rate. That's a very foolish prediction to make for a man, but nevertheless, I think that you will see in Japanese society a gripping of like family creation if it becomes financially and professionally possible. In all of advanced countries, a rough equilibrium rate for participation of women in leadership positions seems to be around 30%. We have a huge gap between 10 or 11% currently and 30%. I would predict that that's not going to be achieved by 2030, despite predictions by the government, but it will be during what I hope will be our long lifetimes. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Yuko Kawa. I'm just arrived here from Japan, and as the previous speaker said, that there are more opportunity for a lot of women to go to college or work and promote. But today I want to more focus on how it is difficult for women to change. My main topic is marriage. As Emot-san said, the marriage rate is still decreasing. Like 1970, it's about 10%, and now it's 4.9%. In fact, this is still higher than EU average, which is 4.3. But in Japan, it's quite important issue because we are closely related to the birth rate. We have one of the lowest percentage of birth out of wedlock, 2.3% in 2015 as compared to the EU average of 40%. So, but about 10 years ago, it was said that the decreasing marriage rate was based on the people's own decision. So they don't want to marry. They just choose when to marry. But in 2007, the situation has totally changed. And there's two social activists raised the question that decreasing number in marriage rate is not due to the voluntary late marriage or even marriage abstention, but because of they cannot get married. Although around 90% of men and women wants to get married someday, but they cannot do because they cannot no longer expect to meet partners naturally. So we are just sit and wait someone to introduce, but there's no more. or a declining number of breadwinner. So increasing in non-regular workers, so we can no more rely on the breadwinner. So finally, they said that 1 in 4 remains unmarried in their lifetimes. As a solution, they said that if they want to marry, they should be proactive. So they coined the term so-called konkatsu. It's quite common now in Japan. It's etymological recombination of the traditional words for university graduate of job hunting and marriage. So they said that if you want to work, you go to headhunter. Then it's quite natural to go for marriage. If you want to get married, go for matchmaker too. So they legitimized matchmakers as marriage hunting specialists and facilitate to go proactive hunting to find a partner if they want to get married. And also, they also told them to change existing gender role because we cannot expect breadwinner system. This change was a big challenge for Japanese women since proactive action was stigmatized as last resort. So people who cannot find anyone, they have to be proactive. That was the social norm, kind of norm. But after the coin the term konkatsu, that became the big boom. Like it became the word of the year in 2008, 2009. And TV drama for named konkatsu was aired on national TV. And also commercial actor engaged to take advantage of that boom. And also get many customers. Even 2 matchmakers listed on the stock market. And not only matchmakers, but hotels, travel agency, beauty salon, cosmetics, even bank or hospitals offer the konkatsu-related services. And also the government support for konkatsu has passed. So this is like we call the konkatsu party. They are meeting each other. And also this is the personal matchmakers. It is quite expensive, but they list it. This is even the konkatsu apartment. This is the kitchen here, next to the bathroom. Yeah. This is also a property design office new product. And also the article of a newspaper article surged in number after the boom. It's obvious a lot of media tried to report the konkatsu boom. So as I said, it was the stigmatized practice. It is not only the surge in number, but the media sentiment was also totally changed. Before the boom, the people doing finding partners, they're like using anonymous and blind hold it. But after the boom, they're just saying real name and face up. And even the kind of konkatsu became kind of fashionable. So in the women's magazine, they talk how to act or how to talk, what to do, what don't do. So it's kind of it's quite became big boom after 2008. So, but marriage rate still declining after the boom. It is quite cynical situation. Business get a lot of money, but the social problem doesn't solve at all. And how about gender norm? The social activists urged to change the gender norm, but here's the marriage partner preference It's male and female. Like the most important factor is personality, but second factor is different from male and female. For male, appearance is important, but female income is important. And as you see, the number is increasing after the boom. So we see the gender norm is maintained, even strengthened after the boom. And this is strong correlation with the men's income and marriage rate. This is unmarried rate by annual income, by gender. So when you see the male, it's quite a strong relation to if they marry or income, married rate and income. And the government report says that 40% of female likes to get married with more than 6 million years. So here it's 6 million years. But it's a limited number of people, so it's quite severe competition between female. In summarize, how Japanese women changed after the boom, the change in action exactly, and women became proactive, open to engage in contact, although they were stigmatized, but even became fashionable. But traditional gender roles were maintained or even strengthened. Women still prefer to get married with men who are economically secure. And then what happened to the business side? Why the gender role has not changed? And this is the ad from largest party company ad. So top is only for male executive party, and second one is male public servant only. So women who wants to be more secure job, the women go to this type of party. And the bottom one is only female nurse and child care only. So men also likes the caregiver type of women. So this is the ad, and also they said this is quite popular for users. And next one, the example of largest #1 matchmakers ad. And they were proud of, they're saying that we have more high-spec members rather than competitors. So when they say high-spec, they're saying that men with income over 6 million yen and women aged 20 to 30 years, that's 30 ages. So when they say high-spec members, means income, men for income and women for age. And also this ad says at the bottom, high-spec men have an average marriage rate of 70%, about 30% higher than regular members. Request from women is about 1.4 times higher. So this is from the company side, but also Japanese women stick to the traditional gender role. And let me summarize what happened here. We had a social activist who wants to solve the problem, a social problem, which is declining that marriage rate. And their action was, as an action, they told proactively find marriage partner, don't want for a friend or family or colleague, boss to introduce. So based on their idea, commercial actors follow and create Konkatsu market in order to facilitate the behavior of unmarried. So there are multiple services for activities. However, norm side, social activists said to change traditional gender norm and don't rely men's economic strengths, but commercial actor change the meaning, maintain the gender norm in their ad. So although there's a social activist claimed to be proactive, change the norm, but commercial actor maintain the gender norm. So as a result, this side, in this meaning, the konkatsu boom became diffused. So they become proactive with traditional norm, resulting in strengthened gender norm. This was based on the different purpose of the different actors. Let me summarize the last one. What was the boom then? The first different actors like social activists and commercial actors with different purpose. And social actors to fix the social problem, and commercial actor to make a profit and meet customers' need. And commercial activists decouple the practice and meaning in konkatsu. So this was the meaning of konkatsu, but they decouple the meaning of konkatsu action and norm, and drew on the terminology and facilitated proactive action with maintaining traditional gender role. The original meaning of konkatsu by social activists was co-opted by commercial actors. In the end, the social problem was unsolved because of the diffusion of the konkatsu with its old meaning. Thank you.
Fascinating set of presentations. I'm just going to invite the panelists to come back up to the table. So I'm just going to I'm going to spend a few moments just following up with them on some of their presentations. It's really to give you a chance to think about your questions. I'm going to come to the audience pretty quickly. And, so nice. So get your questions ready. But I'm just going to ask each of the panelists one question to kick off our discussion. But before I start with Yumiko, I have to ask you first, why was the kitchen next to the bathtub? That's a good question. Is there a microphone? Sorry. I'm quite loud.
I don't know. I was just in the newspaper. I read the newspaper. According to the newspaper, Japanese women are too shy to promote herself when they're doing konkatsu. So kitchen and bathroom is more two main sexual appeal too. So it's kind of sensitive.
Thank you. Well, I guess, if you cook a great meal, you can eat it in the bath. That's an appealing thing. Okay. I thought those were just fantastic presentations. Really raised a lot of really interesting questions. So I'm just going to, as I said, kick off the discussion with just a question to each of you, a real one to you in a moment, Yumiko. So first, so Bill, I thought you were very brave to start off with a title slide that said Japan's female future. But you did it very well. The question I wanted to ask you was, I thought you had some very specific recommendations, which were fascinating. One of them was early leadership opportunities for women in Japan. And one of the things that I've heard speaking to Japanese executives and researching the economy is that the many female executives in Japan, there's not many, but those who have been there for a while, they say the multinational companies do it better. So is there scope for domestic companies perhaps to mimic what's worked in multinationals companies as one way of creating these opportunities so that labor market interruptions don't become a permanent dampener on female labor force participation and importantly, advancement through the company.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think surveys of female employees in Japan, why graduate professional employees, why they leave their jobs. Dissatisfaction with the job is much higher than leaving to have children. So the biggest, and indeed it's, international surveys, if a survey comparing where American women in their 25 to 35s leave their jobs versus Japanese women in 25 to 35s, American women are much likelier to leave their jobs for child-raising reasons. Japanese women are much likelier to leave their jobs for jobs dissatisfaction reasons. So what is that telling us? It's telling us probably that female graduates don't feel on average, and of course we're talking on averages, that they're willing to or likely to benefit from making the kind of long-term commitment to a company that makes you endure the job rotation in basically crummy jobs as a route towards getting the better jobs, right? There isn't that same sense of commitment. And I think probably the surveys also show that for a reasonably large number of women in these positions, the choice of career or not, and choice of full-time regular work versus part-time regular work is a more transactional choice. In other words, there's a sense of that you can either do it or not, rather than needing the responsibility to do it. So that's why I say, and experts that I've spoken to at Japanese universities have said that actually for companies who wish to increase their retention rate of female graduate recruits who are doing well in their 20s and early 30s, what they need to do is to give them motivation. And to give them motivation, it means sponsoring them in a way to give them earlier responsibilities that make them convince them that it's worth staying. Worth staying after they have children. B, but either way. I'm told that there are companies doing that. One example that cited to me was the Kirin Brewing Corporation has particularly adopted this, but I think there are others. Furthermore, in some sectors there's quite an increase in the adoption of mid-career recruitment. That is also throwing around or throwing to one side the sense of kind of the steady seniority-based trajectory. So I went to see Sompo Life Insurance, who are very big on that, for example. So I think that you are seeing some innovation in HR policies by companies. Can it yet be described as it were, a huge fashion trend equivalent to konkatsu? I'm not sure that it can yet. And the big question is how fast this will progress. Now, from companies' point of view, basically the labour shortage for them is biting hard now. Finally, the hidden supply of part-time, non-regular workers among men and women is running out now. Finally, probably it's not completely run out, but it nevertheless is running out. The constraint on as it were, access to qualified professionals, that is acting as a real bite. So I think that more and more companies are just going to face up to this out of necessity. But those who do will be the ones who thrive. Those who don't will be the ones who have difficulty, in my view.
Super. And then a final question to you, Miko, before I open it up. So we've heard, I thought your presentation really nicely captured how difficult it was to shift cultural norms, because a lot of what we're discussing around raising innovation, changing corporate culture to get more women in the labor force and to be promoted, both of those things help the growth rate. But obviously one of the impediments, which is very difficult to overcome, is always cultural. And so your Konkatsu example, I think, was perfect in illustrating this phenomenon. So what would shift traditional perceived gender roles, in your opinion? Easy question. Certainly not the Konkatsu commercial company.
This is quite a difficult question. I mean, from my presentation, I don't blame the not changing women or women seeking for economic secure, but I want to emphasize how it is difficult because speaking to the women, I realize they are also suffered or they want to change their own norm, but they say they cannot change. So they know it is difficult to find economic secure anymore, but in some reason they are kind of embodied a norm in themselves. So it is quite easy to change themselves. There is an opportunity or there is a benefit, but still it is quite difficult to change the gender thing or norm. So I don't have a question. I don't have an answer. Yeah, but maybe that's the Japanese, typical Japanese, that something changing is quite slow. Like your book, the industry change is quite slow. So in somehow we have quite something that make it difficult for change.
No. That's I think it's a very realistic look at a very difficult issue. Well, for my 2 cents worth, I think having professors like you, central bankers like Yuko, that's actually how cultural change comes about.